I want to take some time to explain this concept that I have called the dialectic fractal, which is something that I've come up with out of a combination of Hegelian philosophy and epistemology more broadly, as well as a little bit of radical doubt. In epistemology, which is the philosophy and the study of how we know what we know, there are conceptions of how we can understand something to be true, which typically boil down into you having to use deductive logic based on some kind of first principle in order to establish something as being necessarily true. And the reality is, when you break down this model to its core, you can go to the very bases of logic and argue whether or not logic itself is factually true. Why should we prefer logic to illogic? And even beyond that, you can get into the illogical and completely irrational realm of thought and of dialogue and of conversation. How we know what we know is always going to be based on some kind of subjective measure of where we cut off the trunk of this tree. And it is a tree. So ordinarily in the West, we cut off the trunk of this tree at logic. We start with logic and we establish every other notion and conception from there. And so logic is the trunk, is the root of our tree of knowledge. But in truth, there are items below that, stuck in illogic, and there are branches out from there. So let's talk about logic itself in order to explain how this works and what it might mean. So in the world of logic, you know that if A and B, therefore C, right? Basic logical formulation, computation, basic synthesis. In logic, you start with a series of premises in order to establish some fundamental truth. And none of these premises can be proven. They are premises, they are things that you accept to be true for the purpose of creating some logical argument. Each of these premises acts as a branch that branches off of our root. If any of them are incorrect, there is a branch for that premise being incorrect that branches off from our root as well. So, anytime you make any kind of logical argument, you create a scenario in which you have at least two branches. One that says, if this premise is true, I can create this logical structure to branch off from it. And if it's not true, this other branch must also branch off from it, which we won't explore. Why does this matter, or how does this apply to reality today? Let's say it's the case that you want to understand basic physics, and you've used logic and reduced it down into math. We have an extremely large, very complex tree of decisions that have concluded that mathematics is logic and that observations of our universe are real, which both of those assumptions can be challenged. The next logical step is you measure what occurs in the universe and you compare it against itself in order to further expand this model. This is what science is. You have a hypothesis, which is one branch of the tree. You perform a test to determine if that hypothesis is true, and that tells you which branch next in the tree do I take. As this applies to physics, you say, I think that gravity works this way. Here are the measurements. It turns out gravity doesn't work that way. We're going to take this other branch. And the number of branches that exist on any particular trunk are infinite, and these trunk branch systems exist for every possible bit of knowledge in the universe, outside of the universe, and everywhere else in between. And not all of them are rooted in logic. You can have branches that are rooted in illogic as well. These branches go on infinitely in both directions because the sum of knowledge can always be more complex and more in depth. You can create systems of knowledge where preceding branches must be true in order for subsequent branches to be true. You can create systems of knowledge where branches rely on one another to be true. So, as an example of that, if you were trying to explain classical mechanics and trying to explain quantum mechanics, today we explain those as being two different tree systems, both of which back themselves up to the pre-assumed truth of math being a form of logic, and logic itself being valid, but the two trees do not connect to each other even though both are true. It may be the case that there is some connecting fundamental universe, some set of branches in which both can be contained in one knowledge set. And this is ultimately what humans strive for. We want one system of understanding everything that flows freely from end to end. We don't want competing systems where we have different assumptions, different inputs, and different outputs as a result. And you can apply this to every bit of knowledge, not just physics, not just math, not just logic necessarily. You can apply this to how humans work. Economics is a branch off of psychology, which sociology is also a branch off of, and both of those operate differently. And psychology is just a branch off of biology, which is just a branch off of chemistry, which is just a branch off of physics, which is just a branch off of math. Our entire process for understanding the world is a series of conversations to determine which of these branches we ought to take. And these conversations occur between people in order to try to justify inductive, deductive, and other forms of logic, as well as between data, where we try to gather data and use the process of science to determine what is true. But there are other ways of determining truth as well. We simply don't use them today in the 21st century. And there may also be other forms of determining truth that we have yet to discover. So we've established that the way that what we understand to be true changes is through dialogue and discourse, right? Hegel called this a dialectic. You have one conception of the truth, somebody offers an alternative opinion, you follow up on the data, the information, the logic as you have it available, and determine which of those is true. And this occurs for every single person over time. What this means is two things. First, that a society will have a consensus on which branch is true, which branch we are currently following. And that you will have outlier people who exist in an infinite variety of these infinite segments of branches who have different starting assumptions and different following conclusions. This means that there are subjects that are fact, quote unquote, but we can't ever really know because there are different trunks of that tree of knowledge that are possible or plausible. You have a consensus view on every possible subject under the sun. What this leaves you with is a fractal of branches of trees of knowledge in multiple dimensions. Four-dimensional fractal branches of knowledge that are changed by dialectics, that are changed through conversations with one another. And not every person is in the same tree. We don't have very good means or methods for mapping out these trees or determining where we are or where the consensus is or what we have and have not proven. Science attempts to do this through things like scientific papers, but even that process is not perfect. An example of this was pointed out to me in a podcast where there is this concept of VBACs, which are situations where a woman had a cesarean section birth with a prior child, but now wants to have a vaginal birth. And there's a conception of what the risks are and how to calculate those risks. Some of the research that was done to build this calculator and these conceptions, it turns out, was flawed and made the entire process racist, frankly. And we can't determine how far back in the tree for any system of knowledge those types of problems might exist. And so we have to remap constantly, over and over, each of these infinite variety of branches with an infinite variety of information. Truth is not just unknown, truth is unknowable. There are too many possible branches for any one person or any one society to get through, and trying to achieve consensus between a bunch of persons is even more difficult. So we have a dialectic that is how we convey knowledge to one another, and that dialectic is imperfect because each of us exists in different locations on the different infinite tree of branches, and no person can ever contain all of it in their head. It simply can't happen. So, that's my concept of the infinite fractal dialectic. It's a scenario in which knowledge goes up continuously with more and more assumptions baked into what is true, and goes down infinitely with more and more of the base assumptions that establish our truth being questioned, all the way back to logic and even before logic, into illogic and other conceptions of truth. And it also covers how those truths are communicated and why we can never all be on the same page, specifically due to the fact that these trees are so complex that everyone is always in a different location. What this means for society is that it's very difficult to establish one consensus as our system of knowledge grows more and more complicated, because fewer people will be on the same branches. This may cause societies to break down. This may cause issues like we're seeing in politics. This may cause issues elsewhere. These prior assumptions and where we are on these fractal branches of truth are extremely complicated and extremely difficult to communicate to one another. Anyway, that's all. I wanted to put all of that together. Maybe I'll put it on paper at some point and reference a whole bunch of other philosophers that make my conception valid or valuable to someone out there, but I wanted to share my understanding of the fractal dialectic. Thank you for your time.